The Gobi Desert doesn't forgive mistakes. It stretches across southern Mongolia like a wound in the earth, scorched by day, frozen by night, and almost completely empty. Most animals don't survive here. Most ecosystems don't recover here. And yet, in 2012, a small team of Mongolian conservationists made a decision that many scientists called pointless. They released 24 wild Bactrian camels into one of the harshest, most degraded zones of the entire desert. No fences, no feeding stations, no guaranteed water source. Just 24 animals dropped into a dying landscape and left to figure it out. The researchers didn't know if they'd survive the first winter. Some didn't expect them to last 2 years. But 12 years later, the scientists who went back to measure the damage found something they couldn't explain with their existing model. The desert wasn't dying anymore. Something had shifted quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, across hundreds of square kilometers of land that had been considered ecologically dead. What those camels did to that desert wasn't what anyone predicted, and what the desert did in return changed how researchers think about ecosystem collapse, recovery, and the thin line between the two. This is what actually happened. To understand what happened, you have to understand what the Gobi was becoming. By the early 2000s, ecological surveys across southern Mongolia were returning numbers that disturbed even veteran researchers. Grassland coverage had dropped by nearly 40%. In some zones over just 2 decades, topsoil was vanishing, dust storms were intensifying, and the wild Bactrian camel, one of the rarest large mammals on Earth, had been reduced to an estimated 900 individuals, scattered across the entire Gobi and Taklamakan desert system. 900 animals across 2 countries. In a habitat the size of Western Europe, the species wasn't just endangered, it was functionally disappearing from ecosystems that had depended on it for thousands of years. Most conservation programs at the time focused on captive breeding, controlled environments, protected reserves, monitored populations. Safe, measurable, predictable. But a Mongolian biologist named Sarampunsek had been studying wild camel movement patterns for nearly a decade, and he had noticed something that the standard models weren't capturing. Wherever small groups of wild camels still roamed freely, the surrounding vegetation looked different. Not dramatically, not obviously, but different enough that he started mapping it. What he found didn't make immediate sense. These were animals moving through dead zone, areas with minimal rainfall, degraded soil, almost no ground cover. And yet, along their trails, something was quietly coming back. He couldn't explain it yet, but he was certain of one thing. The camels weren't just surviving the desert, they were doing something to it. Sarampunsek brought his findings to a small team of environmental scientists in Ulaanbaatar. Most of them were skeptical. The idea that a large grazing animal could somehow benefit a degraded desert landscape went against conventional thinking. Grazing animals destroy vegetation. Everyone in the room knew that. Overgrazing had been one of the primary drivers of desertification across Central Asia for decades. Goats, sheep, cattle, they had stripped entire regions bare. So the suggestion that camels, also grazers, also consuming vegetation, could somehow reverse that process seemed at best counterintuitive. At worst, it seemed reckless. But Sarampunsek had brought satellite imagery. He laid it out across the table: thermal maps, vegetation index overlays, soil moisture readings from the past 6 years. The correlation was undeniable. In areas where wild camels had moved through regularly, soil compaction patterns were different. Seed dispersal data showed higher germination rates along known camel movement corridors. And there was something else, something in the thermal imaging that one of the soil scientists in the room immediately recognized: subsurface moisture retention. In specific zones that aligned almost exactly with areas of consistent camel activity, the ground was holding water differently. Not much water. This was still the Gobi, but enough to matter. Enough that one researcher quietly set down his pen and stared at the map for a long moment. Then he looked up and said something that nobody in that room had expected to hear. He said the desert in those zones wasn't behaving like a desert anymore. The release was approved in the spring of 2012. 24 wild Bactrian camels, carefully selected for age, health, and genetic diversity, were transported by truck into a remote corridor of the Great Gobi strictly protected area. No ceremony, no press coverage, no fanfare. The team unloaded the animals at dawn, stepped back, and watched them walk into the desert. Within minutes, they had disappeared into the gray-brown expanse. The researchers placed GPS collars on 14 of them. The other 10 moved untracked, a deliberate decision to see if monitored and unmonitored animals would behave differently. For the first 8 months, the data was quiet. The camels were moving, covering vast distances, sometimes 30 to 40 kilometers in a single day. But nothing remarkable was showing up in the field reports. Then the first winter hit. Temperatures in that zone dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius. 2 of the younger camels went silent on the tracking system. The team assumed the worst, but when a ground crew reached the last known coordinates of one of the missing animals, they didn't find a carcass. They found tracks, fresh ones, leading northwest toward a dry riverbed that didn't appear on any of the ecological maps for that region.
That's impossible. The map shows nothing, yet the river is clearly visible. This changes everything.
The crew followed the tracks for nearly 6 kilometers. What they found at the end of them stopped the lead researcher mid-step. There was water, not much, a shallow ice-edged seep pushing up through cracked clay. But it was there, and standing around it, all 14 GPS-tracked camels, plus both of the animals they thought they'd lost. The camels hadn't wandered. They had led the team to something the map said didn't exist. The seep was real. A hydrologist from the Mongolian University of Life Sciences was brought out to assess it within weeks. What he found beneath that cracked clay surface was a shallow subsurface water table, ancient, slow-moving, fed by snowmelt drainage from ridgelines nearly 80 kilometers away. It had always been there, completely unknown, completely unmapped. And the camels had found it not by accident, but because they had been here before. Not these specific animals, but their ancestors. Wild Bactrian camels had roamed this exact corridor for thousands of years before hunting pressure and human expansion had pushed them out in the early 20th century. The water memory, as the team began calling it, was written into their instinct. They weren't discovering the seep, they were returning to it. That realization changed everything about the study. Because if the camels knew where the water was, and if their movement patterns were organized around these hidden subsurface sources, then everything they were doing to the landscape suddenly had a different explanation. The trails they carved through compacted desert soil weren't random. There were corridors running almost always between water points, and those corridors were doing something that no restoration team had managed to achieve through direct intervention. They were breaking the surface crust. In the Gobi, surface crust is one of the primary barriers, preventing rainfall from penetrating the soil. It forms over decades of wind, heat, and drought, a sealed layer that causes water to run off instead of soaking in. The camels were breaking it open, kilometer by kilometer, season by season, without any human direction. But here was the part that the team wasn't prepared for. When the next rainfall event came, a modest 18 millimeters over 2 days, the infiltration rate along camel corridors was nearly 3 times higher than in the surrounding untouched desert. 3 times. The soil scientists ran the numbers twice, then a 3rd time. The results didn't change. And that's when one of the senior researchers pulled up the Vegetation Index satellite data from the past 2 years and went very quiet. The satellite data covered 847 square kilometers. The zone the 24 camels had moved through over 12 years of free roaming. And across that entire area, the Vegetation Index had shifted, not dramatically, not like a rainforest had appeared overnight, but measurably, consistently, in a pattern that followed the camel corridors almost exactly. Saxal trees, the deep-rooted, drought-resistant anchors of Gobi Desert ecology, had increased in density by nearly 28% along primary movement trail. Ground-level vegetation coverage in corridor-adjacent zones had more than doubled, and the soil moisture retention data told the same story. The desert was changing, not because of a government program, not because of artificial irrigation, not because of any human intervention at all, because 24 animals had been allowed to do what their species had done for thousands of years. Move, feed, break the crust, disperse seeds, find the water, return to it, and do it all again. The population had grown too, from 24 animals in 2012 to just over 130 by 2024. Self-sustaining, unmanaged, expanding. Sarenpunsig, now in his late 50s, returned to that dry riverbed where the team had first found the seep. It wasn't dry anymore. Seasonal water was now holding at the surface for nearly 6 weeks after snowmelt. Saxal roots had reached the subsurface table. Birds had returned. Reptiles had returned, and desert foxes, absent from field surveys in that zone for over 2 decades, had been photographed at 3 separate locations. The ecosystem wasn't restored. That word implies it was finished. It was recovering, slowly, quietly, on its own terms. What the researchers had assumed would be a small, uncertain experiment in a dying corner of Central Asia had turned into one of the clearest demonstrations of rewilding science seen in the region. Not because the plan was perfect, but because they had trusted the animals to remember what the land needed, even when the scientists had forgotten. If stories like this one matter to you, real events, real consequences, real science, consider subscribing. There are more of these waiting.